David had always dreamed of owning a peaceful home where his children could play safely and where his family could grow roots. When he and his wife, Sarah, bought a modest two-story house in a neatly arranged suburban community, he felt that dream had finally come true. The neighborhood seemed quiet. The streets were lined with tall trees, and the front yards were decorated with flowers. For David, it looked like the perfect environment. But things began to change only a few months after moving in. One morning, as David was preparing to leave for work, he noticed a white envelope taped to his front door. At first, he thought it might be a flyer or a neighbor's note. When he opened it, his heart sank. It was an official notice from the Homeowners Association, HOA. The letter claimed that his front yard grass was unacceptably tall and violated neighborhood standards. The penalty was shocking. $500 per day until the problem was corrected. David was stunned. Just 2 days earlier, he had spent his Saturday mowing the lawn. He prided himself on keeping his yard neat. He showed the letter to Sarah, who was equally surprised. "This must be a mistake," she said, trying to calm him. David decided to call the HOA office immediately. When he finally reached the HOA president, a stern woman named Mrs. Klein, she dismissed his concerns. "Our inspectors saw your lawn, and it's not up to code," she said sharply. David tried to explain that he had trimmed it and could even show proof, but she refused to listen. "Rules are rules," she repeated before hanging up. Over the following days, more notices began to arrive. Each one repeated the same threat: $500 fines that stacked daily. David began to feel pressure in ways he hadn't expected. His children overheard his worried conversations with Sarah, and even his neighbors started to whisper about the unfair treatment. Some warned him that the HOA had a reputation for targeting homeowners and forcing them into paying outrageous fees. David felt trapped. He had always believed in following rules, but this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. The anxiety began to affect his sleep, and every time he looked at his yard, he felt a sense of helplessness. For the first time, he wondered if moving into this perfect neighborhood had been a mistake. But deep inside, a quiet determination was growing. David wasn't the type to back down from unfairness. He knew he had to find a way to fight back, not just for himself, but for his family, and perhaps even for his neighbors who might have faced the same treatment in silence. And so, what started as a nightmare would soon transform into a plan so unexpected that no one in the HOA could have imagined it. The pressure on David's family grew heavier with each passing week. Every time he checked the mailbox, another intimidating letter from the HOA was waiting. The language grew harsher. Final warning, escalation of penalty, immediate legal action. Each envelope felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Sarah tried to keep the household calm, but even she couldn't hide her worry. "David, what if they really take us to court? What if they put a lien on the house?" she asked one evening. The children, sitting at the dinner table, exchanged nervous glances. It broke David's heart to see his family caught in fear over something as ridiculous as lawn grass. He decided he couldn't let this continue. "I'll go to the next HOA meeting," he told Sarah. "They need to hear me out face to face." When the evening of the meeting arrived, David dressed neatly, collected printed photographs of his lawn, and even gathered receipts showing when he last bought fertilizer and lawn care supplies. He wanted to present a solid case, confident that reason would prevail. The HOA meeting room was inside a small brick office building just a few blocks away. David walked in, greeted by a dozen homeowners sitting in folding chairs, whispering about their own concerns. At the front of the room sat the board, 5 people behind a long table, with Mrs. Klein in the center like a judge presiding over a courtroom. When David's turn came, he stood up, held his photographs high, and spoke calmly. "My lawn is not in violation. I trimmed it just before your notice arrived. Here's proof. I believe there's been a mistake." For a brief moment, he thought someone on the board might sympathize, but Mrs. Klein's expression didn't soften. She tapped her pen against the table and replied coldly, "Your photographs don't change the fact that our inspectors observed the violation. If you wish to contest it, you may file a formal appeal and pay the associated fees." The other board members nodded along silently. It was clear they weren't interested in fairness. They were protecting their power. David clenched his fists but stayed composed. "This isn't right. You can't threaten families like this without reason." Mrs. Klein leaned forward with a smile that felt more like a smirk. "We can, Mr. Wilson. It's in the bylaws you agreed to when you moved in. Now, if you don't like it, you're free to move somewhere else." The words stung. He gathered his papers and sat down, humiliated. Some neighbors avoided his eyes, but a few gave him quiet nods of support. He realized he wasn't the only one frustrated. That night, lying awake, David replayed every word of the meeting in his head. The unfairness burned inside him. But as he stared at the ceiling, another thought surfaced. Power like this doesn't come from rules alone. It comes from control of resources. Over the next week, David started researching the HOA board itself. He dug into public records, financial filings, and property listings. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was determined to look. And then, one evening, as he scrolled through an online property site, something caught his eye. The very office building where the HOA held their meetings, the same place where Mrs. Klein dismissed him so casually, was listed for sale. The listing explained that the property had been on the market for months, with no buyers. The owners were desperate to sell. David sat back in his chair, stunned. A slow smile spread across his face for the first time in weeks. He realized he was holding something powerful in his hands, not a weapon, not anger, but an opportunity. If the HOA wanted to play games with fines and intimidation, then perhaps it was time to remind them that they weren't untouchable. The idea was daring, maybe even a little crazy, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Instead of arguing with the board, instead of begging for fairness, he could change the game entirely. And so David began a new plan. Quietly, carefully, and without telling a soul, he started exploring how he might take control of the very ground where the HOA's authority stood. For the first time since the nightmare began, David felt a spark of hope. For weeks, David worked quietly behind the scenes. He met with real estate agents, consulted a lawyer friend, and carefully looked through his savings. It wasn't easy. Buying a commercial property was a huge step, but the more he studied the situation, the more determined he became. The HOA had cornered him, treating him like a powerless homeowner. But now he had a chance to shift the balance entirely. The office building wasn't expensive by commercial standards, but it was within reach if he arranged his finances carefully. David and Sarah discussed it late into the nights. At first, she was shocked. "David, are you sure? That's a big move." He nodded firmly. "They think they can control me with fines, but if I own their office, they'll finally understand what fairness means." After weeks of paperwork, bank meetings, and signatures, the deal was finalized. David officially became the new owner of the building that the HOA board called their headquarters. He kept the news to himself, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Another envelope arrived at his house, this one bolder than ever. "Immediate legal action will begin in 10 days unless your fines are paid in full." The total amount they claimed he owed was staggering, tens of thousands of dollars for a lawn that had never been in violation. This time, instead of feeling fear, David smiled. He tucked the letter into his pocket and waited for the next HOA board meeting. When the evening arrived, he walked into the familiar office building, carrying the notice in his hand. The same folding chairs were lined up, the same board members sat in a row, and Mrs. Klein still wore her stern expression. "Mr. Wilson," she said as he entered, "you again. I hope you've come to finally settle your debt." David took his place at the front of the room. His voice was calm, but there was a confidence in his tone that hadn't been there before. "Actually, I'm here to let you know that the debt you claim doesn't exist. And more importantly, things are about to change." Confused murmurs spread among the neighbors in the audience. Mrs. Klein frowned. What are you talking about? David reached into his folder and pulled out a set of documents. He laid them neatly on the table in front of the board. As of last week, I am the new owner of this building. The very office you're sitting in right now belongs to me. The room went silent. The board members glanced at each other in disbelief. Mrs. Klein's face flushed red as she snatched up the papers, her eyes scanning the signatures. The documents were real. You can't be serious, she stammered. Oh, I'm very serious, David replied. From now on, if the HOA wants to continue using this space, you'll have to sign a rental agreement with me. And if you want to treat homeowners with respect, I'll be happy to offer fair terms. But if you continue these baseless fines and threats, then I'll have no problem finding other tenants. The homeowners in the audience began to whisper loudly. Some even smiled. For years, many of them had suffered under the strict and unfair rules of the HOA, and now someone had finally stood up to them in a way no one expected. Mrs. Klein looked at David, her composure slipping. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. This is outrageous. No, David said firmly. What's outrageous is threatening families with false fines and intimidation. All I've done is level the playing field. The board had no choice. Within weeks, they signed a rental agreement with David, and slowly their behavior began to change. Notices became less aggressive. Fines were applied more fairly, and meetings were conducted with more respect. The homeowners felt a new sense of relief, knowing that the board could no longer operate without accountability. As for David, he didn't gloat or rub his victory in anyone's face. Instead, he focused on his family, finally able to enjoy their home in peace. The yard he had fought so hard to defend became a place of laughter and barbecues once more. Neighbors often stopped by to thank him quietly. Some even admitted they had been fined unfairly in the past, but were too afraid to fight back. David had not only defended himself, he had given the whole neighborhood hope. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. You really turned this around, David. They'll never forget what you did. He smiled softly. Sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger or shouting. It's with patience, persistence, and a little bit of strategy. And with that, the man once burdened by endless fines finally found peace, not by running away, but by standing tall and taking control of the very system that tried to break him.